The conversation is going to continue to happen. Marvin Harrison Jr. at 4 or trade back for the best package. Pro Football Focus's Sam Monson joins me today to give his thoughts. Let's discuss.
You are Locked On Cardinals, your daily Arizona Cardinals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, Locked On Cardinals. Alex Clancy here. Follow me on Twitter at Locked On AZ Cards. Still locked out of Twitter. So follow the podcast at the show's podcast channel. Go to the YouTube channel, search Locked On Arizona Cardinals. Hit that subscribe button. Turn notifications on. Thanks for making Locked On Cardinals your first listen, free wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Really excited to get this guy on. Sam Monson from Pro Football Focus. Very outspoken about all things draft nowadays, free agency before. Really appreciate you joining me, man.
Yeah, sure. No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So the Arizona Cardinals from a national lens is often and has been over the last couple of years just overlooked, irrelevant. And with moving on from Steve Keim and Cliff Kingsbury a couple years ago, the jump back into relevancy is what's been yearned for by media members and fans alike here in Phoenix. So with the 2023 season, the Cardinals, obviously the win-loss record wasn't, ideal, but there were what I call proof of concept positives that showed that things were different here with the Arizona Cardinals from the top down. So kind of give me your rundown, what you saw from your lens with the Arizona Cardinals in 2023 overall, and then we'll kind of pivot to more, recent activities.
Yeah, I think last season was always going to be kind of a write-off year, without Kyler Murray for a big chunk of the season. We didn't know heading into last season how much of the season it was going to be. They eventually get him back. They put him out there. He looks solid. He certainly looks like a massive upgrade over what was there before. And so, you can, the new regime seems to be fairly confident that Kyler Murray can be the guy going forward. And I think given the combination of what we've seen from him in the past and what his tool set is, I think that's a reasonable, supposition, a reasonable conclusion to come from. So with that, and I think the way that they operated last offseason, what they did in the draft in terms of being able to get an extra pick this year. Now, the result of that was a lot worse than it ended up looking like it was going to be. Heading into the season, they were odds-on favored to get like the number 1 and the number 2 overall pick, and they end up nowhere near that because of what Houston was able to do, as well as, obviously Carolina having a disaster. But the process was sound, and I think that's a really important thing for this team going forward, is they demonstrated the ability to make these kinds of moves with what is conventional wisdom, sound process. And that, I think, is what this team needs going forward, is a steady dose of that, a steady dose of just good, consistent, solid process moves, and then see how far they can move in the right direction.
Lead NFL analyst, Pro Football Focus, host of Pro Football Focus NFL Pod. I watched a couple little clips, and I watched the most recent wide receiver rankings. We'll get to Marvin Harrison Jr. in a minute. You nailed it on the head. It was a 5-minute clip that I watched. The defense was devoid of talent last year. And I think it was more of Jonathan Gannon and Nick Rallis coming in saying, you know what? The game is going to be approached differently. It's going to be an adult big boy team. It's not going to be a team that, starts 7-0 and 10-2 a couple years ago and then goes on the road and loses to a bad Detroit team, and then things are just falling off a cliff when one thing goes wrong. The resolve, the actual just maturity of this team, even though, again, devoid of talent on the defensive side of the ball, is this something that has shown respect? Teams are starting to respect this team from what they showed last year, even though it's kind of a convoluted green ribbon kind of way.
Yeah, they were difficult to beat last year, and even in situations, even in games where they got down early, a lot of times it's easy enough to be scrappy and to be difficult to beat if you're able to keep the game close the whole way. Like Arizona had games where they were down couple of scores early and still fought back and made it difficult for teams to beat them. And not just bad teams, but good teams. The 49ers struggled to put the Cardinals away when they played last season. So Yeah, I mean, I think that the performance last season showing that they could do that without really a quarterback at that point, and as you said, without much talent on defense, they should have been easy to beat for most teams, and they weren't. So I think that alone gives them an air of respect heading into the season. And then you have a full offseason, a full kind of year with Kyler Murray now coming back to 100% to see what he can do. Hopefully there'll be an upgrade of receiving talent as well to make that side of the ball just significantly more dangerous than it was a year ago. And then the defense, I think, remains the side that needs the most work. But, we have a whole draft to go before we get to see what it's going to look like heading into the season.
Yeah, one more question about last year. Sam Monson, Pro Football Focus, joining me at PFF_Sam. The analogy that I used for Steve Keim when he was removed from his post was, everybody always has a friend growing up that would come over, play with all of your toys, and then leave without helping clean it up. That's what Steve Keim did with the organization. It's kind of left. It was in shambles. Monti Ossenfort and Jonathan Gannon coming in to an organization that was dysfunctional pretty much since its inception. It won a championship, decades and decades ago. But it's been kind of a laughing poverty franchise, is a coin phrase that people use. When you look from a national lens, and I just ask because I think I'm too close, because anything new would be a positive, but in a vacuum, what they've done immediately is something that Steve Keim was unable to do over the better part of a decade, which is just take a beat, just add a little stability, even though the talent wasn't there. Did it look different to you from Monti Ossenfort down when he took that introductory press conference all the way through? Or are these little things where it's like, if that continues, that'll be a good trend. If that continues, that'll be.
Yeah, I think it's little moves here or there, little personnel decisions where you're like, okay, that makes sense. That's a sound kind of strategy. That's a conventional wisdom, smart way of doing it. The trading down last year being a perfect example of it. Like, just little bits and pieces of understanding, number one, where you are in the world right now, where you are in the NFL. You're not necessarily a contending team. You shouldn't be making moves for the immediate. You should be looking to do things for the future. And each one of these things stacked on top of each other kind of puts some more credit in the bank in terms of the new regime and the direction, or the confidence that you have in them, taking them in the right direction.
And you think Kyler Murray's the guy? Like, there's been so many, just the quarterback position is so, it's never been more, manicured when you're looking at the actual position itself. Everything is judged. Everything is questioned. Kyler Murray's better than, the mean, I guess. And you take that in the NFL nowadays and you just set and forget, barring any sort of massive injury concerns or, Jameis throwing 30-30, things like that.
I think he can be. I don't think we know yet what Kyler Murray is. And this is the thing, we have these conversations about quarterbacks like it's a static constant, and these guys don't get better. They don't get worse. They don't change. It's just, this is who they are. And then we tinker the pieces around them. Like, Kyler Murray has still only been in the NFL for a few seasons. And for those first few years, he was getting consistently better every single year, right? Got better year on year on year, overall and as a passing quarterback. And then that stopped happening and it went back in the opposite direction. But we also know that Cliff Kingsbury's offense didn't really evolve that much. It didn't progress. It didn't change a couple of things that remained fairly obvious looking problems from the outside, in terms of that might work in college. It doesn't look like it's working in the NFL, and you're not showing any signs of wanting to change it. You give him credit for, he made a lot of adjustments to his offense immediately when he came in, right? And he immediately dumped the kind of 4 wide air raid, 10 personnel kind of thing. That lasted like a month before he was like, okay, that's not going to fly at the NFL. I'm going to have to make some fairly radical changes. But it still needed to keep evolving, and it didn't. It sort of stopped at that point. It's like, okay, now we have it. Now I know what to do. That system didn't evolve, and it fell apart towards the end, and Kyler Murray fell apart with it. And then obviously the injury came on top of that, and we didn't get to sort of see what he would look like. But in his time in the NFL, he's demonstrated, number one, he can play at a really high level. Number two, he can do it at a passing standpoint. I mean, that 2021 season, I think he led the NFL in big time throw rate, just the sheer volume of crazy passes he was making. So then you start, say, well, let's give him some receiving help. Let's add a number one guy. I don't think at this point you would have any reason not to think he can be a top tier NFL quarterback, but we haven't seen him get there and stay there for a period of time. So it remains a kind of open question for for this regime to get him there.
Yeah, and we're going to pivot here to the draft of Marvin Harrison Jr. in a second. I always say that, Jared Goff won because of Sean McVay, and Kyler Murray won despite Cliff Kingsbury, in spite of Cliff Kingsbury. It kind of clipped his wings in an effort to actually allow him to grow as an NFL passer. So we'll see with Jonathan Gannon and Kyler Murray for a full healthy year in 2024. Sam Monson, Pro Football Focus, joining me. We are going to pivot, talk Marvin Harrison Jr. in the draft next. Locked on Cardinals, your team every day. This episode of Locked on Cardinals is brought to you by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend time, wishing we had more time. I work 16-hour days, love what I do, but, you wish you had more time. And the question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, what would you spend it on? And the best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. And therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, Locked on Cardinals, your team every day. Sam Monson from Pro Football Focus joining me, co-host of the Pro Football Focus NFL pod. Do you like the long form, the hour long?
For the podcast?
Yeah.
I mean, long form is where, like our show, that's where we live. We ended up skewing long form, and it's just gotten longer and longer ever since we started. So 2 hours is not an abnormal show for us, let alone 1 hour.
That's badass. Yeah, I had Trevor Sikkema on last week, and I talked to him about it. Like, his is just 2 hours, 2:15 without breaking a sweat, especially during mock draft season. I was always curious. I came from radio, and the 30 minutes is fun, but sometimes it's not enough. So I was just curious about the long form. So Marvin Harrison Jr., I'm going to bring this tweet up. This was the impetus for me reaching out to get you on. I've wanted to get you on for a long time, but this tweet I couldn't pass up. So a few days ago, you tweeted out, I've seen we've reached the overthinking Marvin Harrison Jr. portion of the pre-draft process. And then in a response to somebody, you said, I think there are very fair conversations to be had. I also think there's bleep clickbait that doesn't bear any resemblance to the evidence. So the conversation, obviously, in the desert is Minnesota's 3 firsts in a perfect vacuum or Marvin Harrison Jr. Before we broach that, Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best wide receiver in this class by a long shot. Yes or no?
I don't think it's by a long shot, but I think he is the best wide receiver prospect in this draft. And in a different draft, it would be by a long shot. Like, the only reason it isn't this year is that I think in most seasons, Malik Neighbors from LSU and Rome Odunze from Washington, either one of those guys could be a number 1 wide receiver in most draft classes. And all 3 of them are coming into the NFL at the same time. So that's the only thing that stops Marvin Harrison Jr. from being number 1, comfortably the best, and number 2, by a mile and definitely, and all those kinds of things.
The interesting dynamic between the offense that he was running with Ohio State and then, the high-powered, just popcorn flick Madden on easy LSU and Washington offenses, does he get more benefit because he put up those numbers in that offense? Or is this truly just you're watching greatness? He does it pretty effortlessly, which is pretty obvious. He's great at contested catches. And you said this in your in the most recent pod when you're doing your wide receiver rankings, like, you were shocked with the 40 he ran because it doesn't look like he's doing anything with any sort of effort. And it doesn't look like he's doing anything incredibly. And then when you put it all together, it's just this masterclass of wide receiver work. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, Marvin Harrison, he just does everything well. Like, interestingly, like he didn't run the 40 at the combine. He's not run a 40 at his pro day because he's sort of said to NFL teams, like, hey, let me know if you need to see this. And they're like, don't care, don't need it, already have it. It's already there. It's on tape. It's in the tracking data. Like, we know he's fast, right? He's there recorded in college football running 22 miles an hour. He's there recording some of the best athletic scores you can see with the GPS stuff. Like, we know he's athletic. We don't need him running a 40 and putting it there. But he's amazing at everything. Like, there are no flaws to the guy's game. And this past season, he showed he was quarterback proof as well. I mean, Ohio State lost CJ Stroud, obviously, and they Stroud followed on from Justin Fields. So they had elite college quarterback into elite college quarterback. And then suddenly they didn't. Without CJ Stroud, they did not have an elite college quarterback at all. And yet Marvin Harrison still put up basically the same kinds of numbers, and that was with being let down by his quarterback and an awful lot of production and yardage left on the table by missed throws. So at that point, you look at what he can do. His hands are incredible. His body control, his ability to go up and high point, all that kind of stuff is ridiculous. He's an awful lot better, I think, after the catch and just generally moving around than you would expect for a guy of his size. I don't see a negative. Like, I don't see a flaw to his game, which is why he's one of the best prospects to come along in, 10, 15 years.
See that? Yeah. And that's, again, Trevor came on and said he may be the highest graded player he's ever graded, irrespective of position. So while that, especially, the Larry Fitzgerald thing with Arizona, like, I don't hold merit in that. I don't hold merit in, fans are saying, oh, they passed on Adrian Peterson. Oh, they passed on Terrell Suggs. Oh, they passed. None of this matters. All the question is does drafting Marvin Harrison Jr. at 4 make this team better than, say, they were to get 3 first-round picks? They'd have to give up 4 and then a third this year or something. You can get 3 blue-chip prospects, arguably the best at 3 different positions. Is that better for this team than Marvin Harrison Jr.?
It probably is. If for only because as good as we think Marvin Harrison Jr. is, we can't be sure. We see these guys every year where we think this guy's an absolute superstar and it doesn't happen. And maybe he's just a good player. Maybe he's a complete bust entirely. I don't think that's going to be the case for Marvin Harrison Jr., but it would be ridiculous not to acknowledge that happens every year. Every year we're convinced there's a player that's going to be great and it just doesn't hit. So if you have a team willing to offer you 3 first-round picks, 3 swings at the bat instead of 1, you would be crazy not to at least acknowledge that probably has a better chance of panning out for you, particularly in this draft where we just talked. There are 2 more guys that are right there with Marvin Harrison. One of those guys might be available at number 11 overall, where the Vikings are picking. So you could potentially drop down to 11, still get Odunze or Neighbors, which even in a vacuum is not much of a drop-off from Harrison. And even if you think they are worse than Harrison, again, just acknowledging the way the draft works, there's a reasonable chance that one of those 2 guys will be better than Marvin Harrison at the next level. It's just the way the world works, right? We thought that that the draft a few years ago was Jerry Jeudy versus CeeDee Lamb versus Henry Ruggs, right? Those are the 3 guys at the top. The best receiver from that draft is Justin Jefferson, who went 5th. It's none of those 3 guys. And the best one of those top 3 was CeeDee Lamb, who I think, did he go 3rd of those 3 or 2nd? Well, he wasn't first anyway. Henry Ruggs was. So you would be crazy not to, like, this is part of the whole process, right? You evaluate these guys, you put them on your board, you rank them, you grade them, you stack them up, but you have to at least be aware that there's a very good chance what you have down on that board simply is not correct, right? And you have to be aware that the chances are the order will be different, or the guy that you are 100% convinced is a superstar, it's not 100%. So when somebody comes in with a different offer or if they're willing to give you something else on top of the pick that you're taking, that you have to weigh that against your degree of certainty. So I think Harrison is a fantastic player. I think he might be the best player in this draft if you were just ranking a big board, position agnostic, so to take value out of it. He might be the number 1 guy on the entire draft board. But if the trade offer that you're getting to give him up is enticing enough, I think it would be bad process to just sort of fixate on this one guy and ignore a deal that was kind of too good to turn down.
It's just so fascinating. It's just a case study in can you change your trajectory of an organization in 2 off seasons and 2 drafts? And that's on the platter for Monti Ossenfort, Jonathan Gannon, Michael Bidwell right now. Sam Monson is going to join me for one more segment. Got a couple more questions, including one wide receiver. If you Cardinals fans who are hell-bent on Marvin Harrison Jr. like you were probably at the start of the 2023 season, and now it's time, and now you may be disappointed. There are plenty of wide receivers at the back end of the first round, early second round. I'm going to talk to Sam about that next. Locked On Cardinals, your team every day. This episode of Locked On Cardinals brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. I mean, the tournament's been pretty bonkers. FanDuel's got you covered with all of it. I mean, good luck picking the outright winner. Going and checking those odds. There are 10, 12 teams that could win it at this point. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. It's $200. Choose on point spreads, money lines, etc. You can even pick who's going to win it all. I know that Connecticut's the odds-on favorite, but this is going to be a weird year. That's $200 at your disposal if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Alex Nancy, Locked On Cardinals. Thanks for making Locked On Cardinals your first listen free wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Sam Monson, Pro Football Focus, gracious enough to join us to talk Marvin Harrison Jr., to talk other alternatives. And all that the Arizona Cardinals have needed is possibilities. I called Steve Keim a restrictor plate. I called him a whole bunch of different things that has, hindered this team from moving forward. And now the Cardinals are smack dab in, an existential crisis of what to do next. Sam, so if the Cardinals move back, there are so many teams, or there's so many players from 11 to 23 that would be top 10 if it wasn't 4 quarterbacks going in the beginning of every draft. So thinking about that, getting value in the first round is it's not either top 5 or no value. I mean, look at the Ravens, look at the Steelers, look at all these teams the Chiefs, for crying out loud, that have found value late in first rounds and have had Pro Bowlers come out of it. To placate Cardinals fans who are Marvin Harrison Jr. or bust, I've got a couple favorite names, namely Xavier Legette, who I think is going to go probably mid-second round, even though he was – listen, there's always a running back and a wide receiver that goes almost a full round higher than what he's being mocked. Like Blake Corum's probably that guy, but, with running back. But is Xavier Legette a guy that can be a wide receiver 1? I know he's listed at 6'3", and then he came in at 6'1", 6'1.5". Like, is he a guy that could be a wide receiver 1 for a team if the Cardinals chose to wait till the second round and draft a wide receiver?
Maybe he's an interesting receiver because I think he can definitely be an impact player, but it might look a little bit more like DK Metcalf than it does some other receivers, right? Which is not to say like DK Metcalf can be as productive as any receiver in the NFL, but he can't do everything that some of these other guys can, right? You can't just put him in every single offense and say, this is what you're running, go and try and be Stephon Diggs. It's not going to work. You need to play towards his strengths, which are giant, freakish size, straight line ability. He's a lot more limited in terms of what he can do than some of these other number 1 wide receivers, but he can definitely be that guy in an offense. Legette, I feel similarly with, in that he's really big. Okay, 6'1" instead of 6'3", but he's 225 pounds, which regardless of your height is a big guy. And he's really fast with it. Like, he's got incredible straight line speed. He's got an interesting story as well, because like on the one hand, the statistical profile is kind of troubling because he's a late breakout guy, like didn't do anything until sort of 5th year. Almost all of his production came this most recent season. But if you kind of dig into it a little bit and look at the reasoning or his backstory, like he's been through a lot of adversity already. He lost his parents when he was younger. He was a quarterback at one point, and not won all the way through. They kind of moved him to quarterback in high school just because he was their best player. So he lost some kind of development time there. Obviously, COVID hit in the middle of that, which jacked his college career to an extent. So he's kind of had, a lot of things to deal with in order to get the opportunity that he eventually got. And once he did, once he put it all together this year, he was really, really good. And I think there's probably still some growing to be done, even though he is, older as a prospect and sort of long in development in terms of number of years. So I do like Legette as a prospect. I think there's a lot to work with there. And, if you're willing to take him and only ask him to do the things that he's good at right now, I think you can have a really productive player. And then obviously you just sort of figure out, can we get better at the other things, or does he remain like this kind of limited player that we have to create this role for.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. That really well put. I mean, because you're looking at two tiers of wide receiver, looking at the top three, and then you're looking at a cluster of guys. A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy's a burner. Lad McConkey, I'm sure, is going to find himself in a good position somewhere to be able to exploit his skill set. If the Cardinals don't, because we just did our Locked On NFL mock draft, and I'm not going to say what I did, but waited till the second round for a receiver, and I went, there are guys like Byron Murphy, Chop Robinson, guys that are going to be at the top of their skill position group. Can the Cardinals find a path to a wide receiver one in this draft if they were to trade back? The biggest issue with the Cardinals with Steve Keim was everybody was under 6 feet. Everybody.
Right.
So now you got Michael Wilson out of Stanford, 6'3". A.D. Mitchell, I think, is 6'4". There are a bunch of big guys, but as you just mentioned with Xavier Leggett, height isn't everything, obviously. So, with that cluster, do you think there's a bona fide wide receiver one outside of the top three? Let me ask it that way.
Yeah, obviously, once you get outside the top three, the risk gets greater, or the
Sure.
sort of the flaws get bigger, and you have to try to get around those. But I do think that those top three guys are all potential superstars, obvious number one candidates. After that, though, I tweeted about this a while ago as well. Ranking 4 through 15 is crazy difficult to do, and it's almost interchangeable. But that means that if you're sitting there in the second or third round, you want a wide receiver, there's almost certainly going to be somebody that's really good sitting there available. And of that group, I do think there's a few of these guys that do have wide receiver one potential, however you kind of want to characterize that. A.D. Mitchell, as you mentioned, the Texas receiver, is definitely in that category. I think Troy Franklin from Oregon is in that category as well. He's got the size, he's got the speed. I think he's got more underneath route running chops than people give him credit for. Leggett, I think, is in that category we talked about before, sort of slightly different type. Keon Coleman from Florida State is a really polarizing guy, but I think he's in that group as well. He's got some red flags as well, but the potential, I think, is really, really good for him. I think maybe Tez Walker from North Carolina would fit in that bucket as well as a guy with legitimate number one potential. And then outside of those guys, you've got just an incredible, a bunch of sort of different style wide receivers. Maybe they're the only guys that can be true number one, superstars, but there's a ton of other just very good wide receivers that can form part of a complementary receiving core.
For sure. And I want to ask you this. This is not directly Arizona Cardinals related, but it's a trend, and I nerd out on this stuff. We're starting to see a trend where the team that drafts the wide receiver is not the team that pays the wide receiver. A.J. Brown. I know the DK Metcalf and Deebo Samuel were, but Justin Jefferson still doesn't have a deal. Are you thinking that potentially this could be looked at as a quarterback window for wide receivers? You draft a guy high, you hit, which is a crapshoot to begin with outside of, a couple no doubters. And then if it doesn't work, you're not giving that guy $40 million. You're trading him and then drafting the next one. Is that a sustainable trend? Or you think this is just kind of more recency bias than anything?
Yeah, I think it's probably more recency bias, but it is an interesting idea. We talked about this a while ago with pass rushers. There were a couple of teams that were really good at kind of manufacturing sacks for edge rushers, right? They were really good blitzing. They were able to simulate pressure. So their edge rushers got a ton of beneficial opportunities. Baltimore was one of them. Arizona actually was for a while as well. But Baltimore was the team that seemed to be able to plug basically anybody in an edge rusher, and that guy was going to get double-digit sacks the next year. And it was, we saw with Pernell McPhee and Matthew Judon and this endless sort of cycle of edge rushers. And we speculated at one point, could they start playing that game where they start doing what you're saying? We draft a guy, we get 10 sacks out of him, his final year, and then we flip him. We trade him, or we move on from him and play the comp pick formula and all that kind of stuff. And I don't think they ever really did that, but I do think it's something to think about. And now, this is the latest year that we're going to say exactly the same thing. Man, this wide receiver class is incredible. It's the best wide receiver class we've seen come into the league in years, right? And it's every year we say that, but it's true. We're not, it's not, this isn't part of a cycle where we just get there and this is the part of the season. For a number of years now, it has been a really good wide receiver class coming into the NFL. And I don't think it's showing any signs of slowing down. So I think we are getting more and more good wide receivers coming into the league, and it's getting easier and easier for them to transition. So it potentially is an option to say, well, do we need to go and pay this guy monster money, or can we go and draft 2 more guys? And I think also, if you look at the way Green Bay, and they've always had a tendency to do this, but I think you can offset the risk of the stuff we talked about before. You're not 100% sure this guy's going to be good. He might be a bust. It might be Jalen Reagor, right? But I think you can offset that by double dipping and getting more than one of them. Like if you wanted to trade away your wide receiver and replace him in this draft, well, don't just draft one guy and say, if he doesn't hit, we're in trouble. Draft 2 or 3 and say one of them's going to be good, because the talent group is insane. So Green Bay last year, I think, drafted 3 wide receivers, and at least 2 of them look like they're going to work out. Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks looked really good. And then they got, at least one more lower down the draft. Grant Dubose, I think, didn't really feature. But the point being, like, Green Bay needed a wide receiver to add to that group. And they didn't say, well, let's just pick one and hope. They said, let's pick 2 or 3, and one of those guys will pan out. And that's all we need. They did the same thing with tight end. They needed a tight end, so they drafted 2. They got Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. Again, both of them look like they've hit. So that's abnormal. That's ridiculously good. But I do think if you wanted to play that game and say the Vikings, right? Instead of saying, let's pay Justin Jefferson $30-35 million a year, what could we get back from him? And then whenever that draft is, whether it's this year or next year, instead of trying to just replace him with the first round pick, let's draft Adonai Mitchell. Well, let's draft Adonai Mitchell, and then let's come back and get, Keon Coleman or whatever. And then later down the draft, let's draft, Jalen Coker or whatever. And we take 3 guys and hope that one of them comes close to replacing what we lost in Justin Jefferson.
And then you could just fall into having one of the best young receiving corps in the league if they all were. Just wild.
Right. Like, I mean, the word, it's like one of the worst things that could happen is that all of them work out for you, in which case you somehow stumbled into a bunch of amazing young receivers.
It's wild. It's wild. Sam Monson, Pro Football Focus, thanks so much for joining me, man. I really appreciate it. Follow him at PFF_Sam, Pro Football Focus NFL podcast. One of the best in the business. Really appreciate it. Alex Clancy, Locked On Cardinals, Mina Kimes. Sorry?
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Alex Clancy, Locked On Cardinals, Mina Kimes joining me on Monday. I'll talk to you then.